We are recording now.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Here's Sarah. There's Sarah. This is Sarah.
Hi.
Sara Horn is the director of the IRB program at Penn State and in the Office of Research Protections, where she, I'm sorry about reading this, but I didn't memorize before I came, oversees the daily operations of the IRB and IRB staff that serve all Penn State colleges and campuses, with the exception of the College of Medicine, which is probably a good thing, because that's a big college. She is responsible for the development of institutional policies and procedures for human subjects research and for educating IRB staff, IRB members, investigators, and community members about the protection of human subjects. So she's obviously the ideal person to be telling us about this today. She serves as a site visitor for the Association for the Accreditation of Human Subject Protection Programs and as an IRB ambassador for the SMART IRB National Reliance Initiative. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks. I got at least one person quietly clapping. So I appreciate your letting me come here and talk to you today, whether you're willingly or unwillingly here. But I'm going to assume willingly, and I see some familiar faces, so I'm very happy that some of you who I know may need to know this information or may be helping other investigators with interpreting new regulations or pointing them in the right direction, that you're here so that I can give you this higher level overview of some of the changes that are coming your way. And the first thing I wanted to let you know is that I'm not moving here now. I wanted to let you know that we are recording the session, obviously, since we just went through the whole recording mess, just so that we can later post this session for others to be able to view and be informed, as you will be today. So a couple of things that we're going to go over today, and we're about 8 minutes in now, so I'm going to try to leave a couple of minutes for questions at the end. But there is quite a bit of information, even in a high-level overview, and that's really just how much we have going on at this point. So we're going to go over some important dates and some current unknowns. It sounds kind of scary, but we'll get there. Review key changes to the Common Rule. The Common Rule's requirements for human subjects research, including things like new exemptions and revisions to some of the current exemption categories, new informed consent requirements, continuing review requirements, and requirements for cooperative research. We're going to go over the transition from the old rule to the new rule, and also some of our recommendations around that transition. And also, I do want to touch on, because all of this is happening at one time, some of the recent NIH policy revisions that either have gone into effect already or that will go into effect in January as well. So you'll see that we've got some competing dates here. And again, it's going to feel like all of this is happening at once. And believe me, I'm feeling that way too. So the final rule that we're going to talk about today was actually published on January 17th, 2017. This was after a whole rulemaking process, years of waiting to see whether change was coming. And if you think back to that day, this was, I think, one of the very last days of the last presidential administration. So we were kind of thinking, if this doesn't go through, it's probably not going to go anywhere. It's probably going to go somewhere to die. And so, we're kind of waiting with bated breath, and at the last moment, they kind of squeaked this through. What that meant is then that it was put in like a 60-day freeze in terms of review by the new presidential administration. So we were really unsure for a long time about where this was going and whether this was going to move forward as was, whether there would be additional revisions. And so now, at this point, given that we are so close to January 19th, we're hoping that we are proceeding as we are planning to. So the important dates here are that all provisions except for the one requirement that we're going to talk about for single IRB review for cooperative research, all of the other changes go into effect on January 19th of 2018. So you got like a little over a month until that time, and a couple of holidays So it's like, yay, prime time to be releasing new things to everyone, right? Like, you're not busy right now. You don't have finals or grading papers or anything like that to be doing. So the single IRB requirement that I just mentioned, and again, this is going to be different from the NIH single IRB requirements, which we will touch on as well. That requirement and the common rule actually goes into effect on January 20th of 2020. So we've got some time to prepare for that, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those requirements. However, I will say that on October 7th, 2017, OHRP did submit a request to delay that date for 1 year, but to allow us to move forward with 3 burden-reducing provisions. Your guess as to what those provisions are might be relatively close to mine because I have no idea. I could speculate on some of those things. If someone were to ask me, I would say I think that one thing that we're going to talk about today is the elimination of continuing review for minimal risk studies. I think that could be something. That is one of those provisions, but I don't know any better than anybody else does. So our plan right now is to proceed as we have been because we have really no other option. And we are beginning to revise. Well, we've been in the process of revising our documents, getting our electronic system, CATS IRB, ready for new submissions. And then we've also started to educate other investigators and people who need to know about what's changing. With the caveat that we could come back at some point and say, guess what? They've delayed this. Highly unlikely at this point, but we just don't know. So since then, I will just tell you that we've been doing a lot of work. We've been meeting with IRB leadership at both the College of Medicine campus and at our campus, talking with colleagues in the Big Ten and other schools who we're close to, attending conferences, soaking in information. We've been meeting with our IRB staff and going through some of these things that I'm going to talk to you about today. You know, how do we interpret these new regulations? What will we require of investigators? We've been updating some of our documents. You're going to hear me refer to the toolkit documents in my presentation. If you're unfamiliar with that, those are the set of policies and procedures, templates like protocol templates, informed consent form templates that we make available to investigators so that they can meet these requirements that I'm going to outline today. And those are available again in our electronic system called CATS IRB. We've been taking an upgrade to CATS IRB so that we can prepare for this next upgrade. So if you're using CATS IRB, you might think, oh my gosh, there were so many new things recently. Well, we're just going to add a few more on top of that. So there will be probably a learning curve, although luckily some of this is more so in the process and not in the submission itself in CATS IRB. We've been supporting various policies that have been put out by NIH, again, that I'm going to mention towards the end of the presentation, and planning for the single IRB review requirement for NIH. And I'm not going to lie, I've been freaking out a little bit. My hair sometimes is like, you know. So if you leave today, if you've never heard of any of this and you're doing human subjects research and you leave today and you're like, oh my gosh, what is going on? It's okay. It's going to be okay. You'll get over it in a couple of weeks, months, years, but we will get through this, okay? So what is the common rule? So if you came to this presentation, you're like, I don't even know what the heck I'm going to hear about today. The common rule, again, is the set of regulations that we apply to human subjects research that is federally funded. So when you fill out particular things in your protocol, if you're doing human subjects research, or you put certain things in your consent form, and we come back to you and say, you actually need to do this, we're using those regulations and the things that we're going to go over today to make the determinations that we need to make, not only for federally funded research, because as I've noted here, we do apply equivalent standards and protections to non-federally funded research. However, you may hear me mention at some point in this particular presentation that we use flexibility in the regulations. And those are some areas where we feel that we can do something different than what this says and still equivalently protect human subjects. So the reason for the revision to the common rule, as stated by OHRP, which I've included here, but was really in an effort, according to them, to reduce burden for investigators while improving protections for human subjects. And I think that you're going to see some areas that you're saying, yeah, that'll reduce burden on me. My job might be easier based on, you know, the new requirements. However, as I've been talking to people about some of these requirements, I want you to keep in mind that oftentimes when burden is reduced somewhere, it's really just moved somewhere else. So there might be somewhere else or something else you need to do based on it, but there are going to be some areas where burden is officially reduced. And I think that in some areas, it'll also take us a while to feel that relief from that reduction. So the changes that I'm outlining today generally apply to all research at Penn State except for the following things. So FDA regulated research. I won't go into too much detail. However, we have what are called sign-on agencies to this common rule. FDA is not one of them. So if you have investigators who are conducting FDA regulated research, or you regularly conduct FDA regulated research with drugs or devices, these new regulations are not going to apply to that research. Also, research conducted or funded by DOJ, because DOJ, again, previously signed on, has not signed on to the revisions. So those two things are going to fall under the old rule. So what that creates is a great little situation for us where we have to, again, delineate and say, okay, for these types of studies, we have to do X, and for these types of studies, we have to do Y. We're going to do our best within both the CATS IRB system and in our templates, our protocol documents, all those sort of things, to point those things out to you, to investigators, so that you can track what rule your study is following. Okay, so the first key change we're going to talk about today is the expanded exemption categories. So in the past, exemption meant that the protocol that you submitted or that your faculty have submitted did not have to undergo IRB review. That doesn't mean that it didn't have to be reviewed by our office. Most people tend to put the types of submissions that we review into 3 buckets. And those 3 buckets are typically exempt determinations, expedited reviews, and full committee. It's not really my preference to put things in those 3 buckets because I really see that there are multiple buckets, some that even come before that. So what I'd like to do for a minute is give you kind of the quick and dirty rundown of how something comes through our office and how we move that through making a determination. So first and foremost, I always like to make this plug when I'm doing a presentation. A submission must actually be submitted to us to do anything with it. So don't forget to hit the submit button in CATS. We just changed CATS IRB. We just changed it to save and exit, but you have to remember after you do that to hit submit. That then sends it to us and we can start our process, okay? And believe me, again, I say this for a reason because I've received calls from people where they say, I submitted this 3 weeks ago, and then I look in CATS and say, no, you didn't. And then they've lost time. So when a submission comes into our office, before we can even consider whether it fits into one of the exemption categories that I'm going to talk about today, we must determine first that it is actually human subjects research. So we have particular definitions in the regulations that we use to determine that. And so that's the first decision we're making. If the answer is yes, we move on to, is our Penn State investigator or investigators engaged in that human subjects research? And again, there are some things that say they're not engaged if they don't, But generally, if they're interacting or intervening with subjects, if they're obtaining consent, if they're accessing identifiable information or specimens, they're considered to be engaged, okay? So if the answer to that question is yes, that's when we move to this. The next step is, can we determine it to be exempt under any of these categories that we have? So we have a whole list of these categories, and each category has its own criteria, all right? And so there are now, with the revisions, 8 categories of exemptions. But today, I'm going to tell you, I'm only going to focus on the ones that have either been significantly revised under the new common rule or that have been added under the common rule. I'm not going to be talking about ones where there were trivial changes or ones that weren't revised whatsoever. So it's important to know, again, that only staff at the Office of Research Protections, our IRB staff, as I'll refer to them, can actually make those exemption determinations. No investigator at Penn State can make an exemption determination for their study on their own, okay? And so now, under the new rule, the same is true, that they're making those exemption determinations, those staff. However, there are a few categories that you're going to see as we talk about this that require what's called a limited IRB review. I wish that they had not called this. I wish that they had placed these maybe in their own category or something, because I think that this gets really confusing, because we usually say exempt equals no IRB review. However, now there are some exemptions that require this limited IRB review. That limited IRB review means that a staff member can determine it to be exempt as long as they have reviewed it for the appropriate privacy and confidentiality provisions and made sure that those things are in place. Because the idea is that the primary risk involved with that particular data in those categories is breach of confidentiality, somebody's reputation, maybe legal risks, not other types of risks like physical risks or something like that. And so as long as we can determine those things are in place, we can determine the study then to be exempt. Yes, it is confusing. All right, so we're going to go through, again, a couple of these that have changed. So what's new in Exempt 1? Exempt 1 is education. And I have not, again, included the whole category here. We're just going to talk a little bit about what's different. So Exempt 1 was an existing category for research that's conducted in commonly accepted educational settings and involving normal educational practices. So an important addition that I've listed to this current category is that there's now a requirement that we ensure that there's no potential for the research to have adverse effects on student learning or on the assessment of educators. So if you're conducting the research during time, does that not adversely impact somebody's ability to learn or the assessment of the investigator? Oh, gonna double check that everything's fine here. Seems that way. Thanks. Okay. So Exempt 2, we have a whole lot that typically falls under this particular category. And the way that they revised this was to provide clarification that the study only involves the procedures that I've listed in the header there. So the surveys, questionnaires, interviews. There's a couple other things in there like educational tests, public observation. And so they clarified that this is not intended to involve studies where there's an intervention, where there's collection of any biospecimens, because oftentimes people are doing a survey and something else. So they're like, oh, it can be exempt too because of the survey portion. And that's not the case if it's more than just a survey. It's more than just a questionnaire. Linking to other available or existing private identifiable information, or when children are involved as participants, except in limited situations. So we can't allow children in particular parts of that category. So the studies, so they added a new piece to this. In the past, you could collect either identifiable information that was not sensitive. So I could do a survey under this category or determine something to be exempt if I was saying, Julie Mitchell, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? I could identify you. That's something that probably isn't going to place you at risk, right? If that information were to be breached. However, it also allowed for studies where no identifiable information was recorded, but the information would place somebody at risk. So I'm asking you about maybe illegal drug use, but I am collecting no identifiers whatsoever. Again, if you couldn't link that back to an individual, that might have been determined to be exempt under 2. The new piece is that studies involving the collection of sensitive and identifiable information may now be determined to be exempt under this category, but the IRB must conduct that limited IRB review. So again, the primary risk here is a breach of confidentiality, okay? And so with that limited IRB review, our staff are making sure that the appropriate privacy and confidentiality provisions are in place to protect that data from a breach of confidentiality. So that's going to be very, very new. And essentially what that looks like, if you think about it practically, things that we were reviewing at the expedited level, which were things like this, collection of identifiable sensitive data through surveys or questionnaires. That was already reviewed at the exempt level. We already made this determination regarding privacy and confidentiality at the exempt level. We're just kind of taking this and now plopping it into the exemption categories, okay?
Sarah,
Yeah.
what would be the difference with exempt with limited review versus an expedited review? There's the reviews in
Yep.
there.
So within the regulations, you
Well,
have
I'm just
other
thinking-
requirements for expedited studies that don't apply to exemptions. For instance, the requirement for informed consent looks very different for expedited than for exempt. Again, we're only determining in that limited IRB review that it meets one approval criteria, but there are many approval criteria at the expedited level that the study would have to meet. And so there are many less requirements at that exempt level.
Maybe I'm thinking more the timeline of things. So,
Mhm.
just so everybody knows, I help to submit proposal applications, so I'm not necessarily in the weeds like I feel like most of but timeline wise. So I know PIs would come in, they're a little bit more excited when they see an expedited review or this, they get really nervous with full review. Is the exempt limited review a day or two or a week or?
So that's a good question because we haven't done it yet, so it's
So
hard
we're
to
gonna lock
give.
you down right now.
It's hard to give you a good assessment. However, I think it's going to be somewhere between, if exempt is the fastest, which it is, and then you have expedited, I think it's going to be somewhere in between there because nailing down those privacy and confidentiality provisions is going to take more time, I think, than just the regular exemptions do.
Okay.
But again, we're not trying to meet all those other criteria that the expedited studies do. And that's why I said I think it's going to be somewhere in between.
Thank you.
Okay, so exempt 3 is a brand new category, brand spanking new, and it's something that we were really hoping for. However, there are some really, what it feels to us to be restrictive limitations that I think will limit how we can use this particular category in a lot of ways. So benign behavioral interventions must be brief in duration. And if you're wondering, Sarah, what does brief mean? Well, I'm wondering the same thing. Okay. So there's some things in the regulations that we're hoping that OHRP will put out more guidance about. This category is one of them because we just have a whole lot of questions. Not physically invasive. That's relatively easy to determine. Harmless or painless? Harmless. Okay, again, that could be wide open. Not offensive or embarrassing. Well, when my staff have talked about this, we've thought, oh my gosh, from one person to the next, especially nowadays. I don't mean to be critical, but nowadays, what's offensive or embarrassing to one person may not be whatsoever to the next person sitting next to them. So, so there will be some period of establishing norms around these things. And I will say that there are a lot of things with the current set of regulations that have been in place for now about 30 years that we've been hoping for guidance on. And, when I say that we're hoping for guidance, I will not hold my breath because I probably will die. And so we're going to have to be establishing new norms around some of these things as we move forward. But again, that's why our staff has spent so much time in preparing, talking about how we interpret this right now as we look at this and talking about examples. And then not likely to have an adverse lasting impact on participants. So again, we've talked about this, like what is lasting? Like for 5 minutes? Like if I do, we're going to talk about deception in a minute, but if deception is used and it upsets them for 5 minutes, is that lasting? Or is it like 5 years or a lifetime? I don't know. And I wish I had all those answers. I just don't right now. Information collected must be via verbal or written communication, and that includes in the regulation data entry by a participant and or by observation, and that can also include like audio-visual recording as well. So I want to note that this category in particular cannot include things like data collection through means of wearing a physical sensor. So a Fitbit, a heart rate monitor, EEG, blood pressure, anything like that. We cannot put those into this category. I don't know if you're aware, but I told you I would mention earlier something about the flexibility that we use in the regulations. And right now we have our own category of exemption that we've made up. And yes, we have the ability to do that for non-federally funded research. And we've been using this for years to cover things like this. And in the last couple of years, we actually expanded that to allow the use of like a Fitbit, heart rate monitor, whatever. So that category then obviously has to change because now some of that is covered under this category. And if it's federally funded, we can use this category. But again, there's going to be a weird situation for those who had previously been determined to be exempt under our own category that we created, because they're going to be saying, well, this could be exempt here before. Why can't it fit this new category? We will work through all of that once again. And it might be confusing for a little bit, but we will work with investigators, especially those who might have used that exempt 7 before. And must also, the third requirement is that you must obtain prospective agreement from subjects. So it's important to note that prospective agreement does not, it intentionally does not say informed consent here. So there's no requirement to obtain informed consent, but you must have some sort of agreement before beginning the research from the subject. So this category can also involve studies that use deception or deceptive methods, or some people refer to it as incomplete disclosure and not deception, I think because they don't want to admit that the study really involves deception. And so we can use this particular category when the subject, again, is made aware that they will be misled about or uninformed about the nature or the purpose of the research, and that they prospectively agree to this. So if you have conducted this type of research, you probably already know this. If you haven't, maybe a couple of years ago, we used to require all the time that people add to their informed consent form a statement like, you know, you will not be fully informed. We can't fully inform you of the purpose of this research before beginning. And it would have all the other information that any other consent had, but it would tell them that with regard to the purpose. That is how I see this. You're telling them what they're going to be doing, but you can't tell them exactly why, or there's something about it that you might have to leave out. And if they're prospectively agreeing to that, then we can consider this to be exempt. Typically, this is also the situation where a debriefing then is going to occur after you have gone through the research protocol with that particular participant. So again, it goes through the same criteria as Exempt 2 does with regard to the collection of identifiable non-sensitive data, non-identifiable sensitive data, and then again, you're allowed to collect identifiable sensitive information under this category as long as we conduct, again, that limited IRB review. Okay. Exempt 4 is for the use of secondary data, particularly secondary data that does not require informed consent or for which informed consent is not required. There were extensive revisions to this particular category. In particular, it used to only apply to data that was existing at the time of submission to the IRB. However, they have now opened this up a little bit to include data that will exist in the future. And if you're wondering, that's kind of strange, like what does that mean? I too, again, am in that same boat. I've had many conversations with my colleagues. What this is not intended to be is a mechanism for investigators to not obtain informed consent from participants, so it's like a workaround. That's certainly not the case. But I think there will be some things that we will learn over time that we can use this particular category for. But I will say that I think it will be particularly useful in other situations. And again, we'll go through these points here. So in order to meet this category, it must meet one of the following criteria. So the data or the identifiable data or specimens are publicly available. The information is recorded. So this is not an and, this is an or, must meet one of these. Information is recorded in such a manner that subjects cannot be identified. There will be no re-identification of subjects and no contact with subjects. Or the research involves only information collection and analysis involving the investigator's use of identifiable health information when that use is regulated under HIPAA regulations, okay? This is going to cover, and we don't have a whole lot of this that happens at our campus, but you may encounter this, or you may have faculty encounter the use of existing medical records in their research. They usually call it retrospective chart review. A lot of retrospective chart reviews that previously had to be reviewed at the expedited level can now be determined to be exempt because those studies, that use of that data is covered under HIPAA. Okay, and the idea here was there are already so many protections in place for data under HIPAA, and the requirement for authorization is in place, or waiver of authorization is in place. And so why require more review by the IRB in those particular situations? I highlighted the word only here, or bolded the word only, because we specifically had a conversation with some of myself and some of my colleagues about the fact that they cannot be collecting data from an existing medical record or a medical record and then also want to do a survey with those same participants, okay? In order for it to meet this criteria, it has to be just that analysis of data. And then the last piece we are probably never really going to run into, but research is conducted by or on behalf of a federal department or agency using government-generated or government-collected information obtained for non-research activities. So if it meets one of those criteria, we can determine to be exempt. And I think this is an area where we're going to have to play around with this a little bit as we get some existing data submissions coming in to determine what really best fits that particular category outside of that HIPAA piece. All right, so I'm going to move forward to informed consent requirements. So there's some new requirements. So informed consent forms must now include a concise and focused presentation of key information. And this is to come at the beginning of the consent form. Again, the idea here is that you, like many participants in research, if you receive a 15-page document on how to use your iPhone, or whether you agree to terms of use for Facebook or whatever, you might read the first paragraph and then you might go, yep, sounds good, I agree. A lot of research has found also that with participants, the longer the consent form and the more complicated the consent form, the less they actually understand from that consent form, okay? And over time, and IRBs, investigators, there are a whole host of people that are responsible for making consent forms really long. And I honestly, I'll raise my hand and say, yes, IRBs have negatively added to that over time at some points. I think in an effort to better inform participants, but consent forms have become really long and really complicated. So the idea here was to change the form so that the process can also change around that form, and to put that key information that one might need to know to make a decision to participate in the study first. So that key information is going to include information about the fact that participation is voluntary, that they don't have to participate in the research, a summary of the research procedures themselves, the risks of participating in the study, especially the most impactful risks, I'll say, are the ones that would have a greater negative effect, and then also the benefits to the participant. Just because this section exists doesn't mean that the rest of the consent form just goes away. Again, this is moving the most important information to the front, or summarizing the most important information in the very beginning. So we actually had a conversation with a representative of OHRP, and we said, hey, we have awful lot of social and behavioral or educational research where the informed consent forms really are only 2 pages long, maybe 3 pages long. We said, we don't really feel like we could make that more concise and focused. I mean, sure, there are things that we could maybe rearrange and put the compensation at the end and whatever. But other than that, you know, these really only include the necessary information. If that's the case, can that be considered to meet this particular criteria? And the answer that we got was yes. And so for some of our shorter consent forms that are not complicated, and we're going to try to build some standards around this that, of course, will be flexible for investigators, but at the same time, we wanted to sort of have a cutoff point. Like, if your informed consent form is longer than 5 pages, we're going to be looking for X. If it's a really short consent form and the information is already concise and focused, then we might be able to argue that it already fits this criteria. Okay, some additional required elements for consent. All informed consent forms must indicate, and this is a big change, and investigators are going to need to think about this, must indicate whether de-identified information or specimens will be used for future undetermined research, or if they will not be used for future undetermined research. So right now, investigators can de-identify information and then do whatever with it, because it is no longer then subject to the common rule, as long as it doesn't meet, basically doesn't meet that definition of human subject any longer at that point. However, now the intent is to inform that those participants that even their de-identified data may be used for future research, or clarifying if it will not be used for future research. There's a few other things that need to be added only when applicable. So the fact that biospecimens may be used for commercial profit, if this is the case, and whether that subject will share in any of the profit. Clinically relevant research results will be returned to the subjects or not. Like, if you're not going to return the research results to them, so say you do a blood test, are you going to give them results of that or not? That needs to be explained when applicable. And then that research will involve whole genome sequencing if the research intends to involve that. Some other notable requirements, so there were some others, but I chose to keep this brief and say other notable requirements were that a waiver of informed consent for secondary use now includes the justification for the use of identifiable information. So we never had people justify. If they said we want to use secondary data that is identifiable, we never had them justify that in terms of giving a waiver of informed consent or waiving that requirement. Now that is a criteria that they need to address. And this is pushing people towards thinking about, why aren't you using de-identified data when you can? And so this might be another point for investigators to go, oh, you know, now I have to justify this use. Is this possible? Clinical trials. So we're going to talk about clinical trials at NIH at the very end of this presentation for a little bit, but this is referring to a new definition that was inserted into the common rule. And the only thing that is linked to that definition in the common rule is the requirement that one consent form used to enroll a subject is made publicly available via a federal website. You might, again, be saying to me, Sarah, what publicly available website am I supposed to post this on? And I'd say, gee, I don't know. We do not have an answer to this at this point. Clinicaltrials.gov was offered as a suggestion. A lot of studies are required to register on clinicaltrials.gov now. Even if they're not required to register, they may be registering for the purposes of being able to publish in a particular scientific journal. So that has been offered as a particular option or suggestion, but this has not yet been identified. And if it's not yet identified on January 19th or by January 19th, I don't know what we will do with those consent forms.
Sarah, the responses that came with the final regulations, I mean, they very much welcome the comments that said we should just use clinicaltrials.gov.
Right.
So I think that's probably the direction it will go.
Yeah, well, we would have to make that, it says it has to be identified by the federal government. So without them saying this is the place,
yeah, right.
I don't know if we can comply with that requirement if they have not actually identified that. So I did include the OHRP definition of clinical trial here, but we're going to talk a little bit about the NIH definition later. And there's one small difference, and it's in the placement of health-related, that particular term. Broad consent for future research with identifiable data and specimens. So this is a new optional provision that has been provided by the government as an alternative to our current mechanisms for obtaining informed consent for future use of identifiable specimens or data. This, to be clear, is not required for research that involves the future use of de-identified data or specimens. But again, going back to what I just mentioned, that future use for de-identified information needs to be indicated in the consent form itself. Because of the questions that relate to this particular provision, and because this is an optional provision, not a required provision, we have decided at Penn State not to implement this provision on January 19th. We will look for further guidance as it has been promised. This is an area where it's been promised by OHRP. We plan to discuss this provision with investigators and determine in the future how this provision may be used at Penn State at a future date. The two exemption categories then that relate to this, which I didn't talk about because we are not using them right now, exemptions 7 and 8 relate to that broad consent provision. And so accordingly, again, those will not be implemented on January 19th here at Penn State. Again, that doesn't mean that we're not going to use them in the future. We want to do this in the right way. And there are a lot of questions surrounding that particular provision. Yep. So elimination of continuing review. So this is going to make a lot of people very happy. So as it currently stands, you know, if you had a study that underwent either expedited review or full review, you had to submit an annual or continuing review to our office, albeit brief, you still had to do that. And so now continuing review will generally not be required for studies that are eligible for expedited review, studies that have been determined to be exempt with limited IRB review, and also for studies that have progressed, so even if not minimal risk or expedited or whatever, studies that have progressed to the point that the remaining research activities are limited to the data analysis, including the analysis of identifiable data, and also situations where you're only accessing follow-up clinical care data that is collected via standard procedures that are ongoing, okay? So it is really important that investigators understand, sorry.
Will they, whenever you determine that, will
Yes.
they have an expiration date that follows the whole program rather than, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
That's okay. So that's coming. So there will still be a date attached to that. And the reason is that we are not just going to send these out the door and say, have a nice day, because we still need to know about modifications to research. So investigators still need to submit modifications to the research. They still need to submit what we call reportable new information or adverse events that need to be reported, potential non-compliance. And they still also need to submit study closures when appropriate so that we know when that study is no longer ongoing. So what we plan to do right now, and this is again still kind of in the works at this point, but we're going to do an annual notice or check-in that's going to be sent to principal investigators to remind them of their responsibilities, what they need to report, and also to check on the status of the study to determine whether, again, that study can be closed. And we do plan then to use that as an anchor to close the study if the investigator does not respond to that particular check-in. Okay, so they're going to have to tell us, is this study active or not? And again, what that looks like right now, we are still in the planning phases, but we will at least be informing investigators that they need to do that annually. So I think that expiration date, Julie, is going to be dependent on how we market that annual check-in as well. Okay, single IRB review for cooperative research. So again, this is the only provision that does not go into place on January 19th of 2018. It goes into effect in 2020. This is not to be confused with the NIH single IRB policy. That policy for NIH-funded research goes into effect on January 25th of next year. Cooperative research, they define as federally funded projects that are conducted at more than one site. So what's different between this and what we're going to talk about with the NIH policy, I hope that we get to that point, is that under this provision, investigators could be conducting just one piece of the protocol. Let's just say today or here at Penn State, I have a project where I am lead investigator, and I'm also working with 2 other institutions. I'm going to house the data here, and I'm getting the primary award, but my colleague here is doing piece A, and my colleague there is doing piece B. Even though we're all doing different pieces of that same study, we are subject to this policy, and therefore that particular study requires the review by a single IRB. Okay, and there are some limited exceptions. I haven't listed all of those here, but then a single IRB must review that study, as opposed to each of our IRBs being able to review and approve that particular study. That single IRB under this common rule will be chosen either by the federal funding agency or department, or will be proposed by the lead institution and then will be subject to acceptance by that federal funding agency or department. Okay, so let's talk about the actual transition for a minute. So I included a link here where you can keep up to date with some of the announcements from the Office of Research Protection. So we have a whole page that we designed around this. We talked today about even some more resources that we would like to create for investigators on our website. But generally right now, here's a link where you can go, and right now you're going to find a page that gives you some general information about the common rule and some other changes. And so for new studies that are submitted on January 19th and after, those studies will be subject to this new common rule, these new provisions that we've been discussing. I also affectionately refer to this as the 2018 rule. Okay? You have to remember again that this doesn't apply to FDA regulated research or research that's funded by DOJ. Okay? For existing studies, those that received approval or determination prior to January 19th, those are going to be subject to the existing common rule or the pre-2018 rule. So again, we're going to do our best for you to delineate where your study falls. But generally, again, remember, so don't get all in a tizzy and think I have to revise my consent form that I'm using in my study right now. No, you don't have to do that. Those new requirements don't apply. If you decide to revise your informed consent forms because you want them to be consistent across all of your studies, at this point, you can absolutely do that, or investigators can absolutely do that. However, they're not required to do that. That also means, again, with that continuing review provision, that existing studies will still have that requirement for continuing review. So the best I can tell you is avoid getting caught in the trap, or if you're working with investigators, help them to avoid getting caught in the trap. Because what could happen is if they submit on January 18th and the new rule goes into effect on January 19th, they submitted probably with the materials under the old rule, and they have not yet received approval. So then they're going to be subject to the new rule on January 19th. And so we're going to have to go back to them and say, now you have to do all these other things. Now you have to go back and fix the smart form because it has changed since you completed this. So we are advising investigators that as best possible, I know it's not always possible, but if possible, submit new studies approximately 2 weeks prior to that date, which would be about January 5th. So aim to have them in by then. Then our staff can work on processing those as quickly as possible. Or after January 19th for the best results. Again, there may be reasons that you want to wait till after the 19th, and I think that's great too. Like if you have a study that's going to be expedited review and you want to wait till after the 19th because you're thinking, I won't have to do continuing review anymore, by all means, do that. Wait until the 19th if that's possible. And I think this also is very important also for full review studies. So if you've got somebody who, again, is likely to be conducting a full committee or full review study, then I think it'd bode well for them to also wait until after January 19th, if possible. But again, I recognize it's not always possible. So here's some places where you can find the updated toolkit documents. So you may be familiar with CATS IRB, but if you're not, this is generally what it looks like, this screen where you find some of the documents that investigators need to use that will be updated. So the IRB library is the screen that I'm showing you here, and that's where we house all of our standard operating procedures, our worksheets and checklists that investigators can use to look at what it is that we are doing when we review a study. And that's also where you can find updated protocol templates, and consent form templates. In addition, there's the Help Center, where investigators can find the investigator manual, which is helpful to them in knowing what their responsibilities are in conducting human subjects research. Release notes for the toolkit and for the CATS IRB system are available there, as well as contact information for both of our IRBs. And I am at time, and I didn't even hit these important policy updates for NIH. So if you'd like me to keep going, I can do that. Take just a couple minutes. All right. So clinical trials related policies. So what I did was break this into two categories, okay? Things that are related to that definition of clinical trials and things that are for all human subjects research that is not directly tied to that clinical trials definition. Okay, so clinical trials, I have the definition listed there, okay? And I don't necessarily need to go through that, but what I need you to know is that many investigators don't want to believe that their study is a clinical trial. They want to run the other way. They want to put their head in the sand. They want to do anything but decide that their study is a clinical trial or succumb to that fact, okay? And they need to know that this definition is broad. And I think it's intentionally broad. And it covers a lot of things that they may not traditionally have thought as being a clinical trial, okay? In the end, their program officer can help to make that final determination, but they need, again, to provide the appropriate information to the program officer so that they can make that decision. We can help with that process. Our quality management program at the Office of Research Protections can also answer questions for investigators who are or seek advice for them. If they need help, that's Katie, Justin. If they need help in that proposal development stage, they can help them get the right answer. Two policies that I want to mention that were released in 2016 that are related to this definition and went into effect in January of this year were the good clinical practice training requirement for all personnel that are involved in NIH clinical trials. That's an initial training, and then every 3 years thereafter, they have to do continuing education, or investigators and students have to do continuing education. Registration and reporting on clinicaltrials.gov for NIH clinical trials. So there are specific timelines for registration and reporting. I don't nearly have enough time to go over those today, but just know that you can't just willy-nilly decide like, oh, I'll get to that someday. No, there are actual requirements for compliance. And then also can be significant penalties associated with non-compliance, including potential risk to future funding, either for the investigator and potentially for the institution. And so it's really important, again, that investigators appropriately identify their study and that they are following through with those requirements. And again, our quality management program has provisions in place now to help investigators meet those requirements and to give them a gentle shove when they need it as well. The following policies go into effect for applications with due dates on or after January 15th, 2018. So applications or proposals involving clinical trials must be submitted through a specific FOA designed for clinical trials or one that says clinical trials optional. They cannot apply through an FOA that does not allow clinical trials. And hence, again, the importance of determining at that very early stage whether the study is a clinical trial or not. New information about clinical trials will be provided in the new Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form, Forms E. And then lastly, there are some new review criteria for applications and proposals that are specific to clinical trials. And most of those things are addressed. NIH has a lovely website where they've been adding information and materials and tools for investigators to use. They even have like a tool that you can walk through, like, is my study a clinical trial? And, you know, click the yes or no. I think it's still difficult in some instances to determine whether it meets those definitions, but I think they are trying and they're putting out information for investigators. So things that are related to all NIH research involving human subjects, not just those that are clinical trials. So in the fall of 2017, or earlier this fall, there was a policy that was revised regarding certificates of confidentiality, and those are now automatically issued for NIH-funded studies. This policy went into effect on October 7th. However, it was applicable to all studies that were active or ongoing as of December 13th, 2016. And there are lots of reasons for that, and we don't have time to talk about it. But our staff at the Office of Research Protections are now working with investigators to get their study, to get information in their consent form about that certificate of confidentiality, to inform them of the limitations on disclosures and of this new policy. So we are now helping people to know what that is and what they need to do. And that policy actually added also new limitations on disclosures of identifiable information. New human subjects and clinical trial information, Form Z. So that again, that new form, Forms E, needs to be completed for all human subject study, not just for clinical trials, but will have additional information for clinical trials included. Recently revised, or they are intended to revise, are two other policies on the inclusion of women and minorities, which was released on November 28th, and also on inclusion of children in clinical research. And we just received recent notice that that policy will be revised. So those are two more things that they're adding to the list.
NIH has been busy.
Yeah, as have we because of them. NIH single IRB review. So this goes into effect, this policy goes into effect for all applications and proposals with a due date on or after January 25th as well. Now, as opposed again to the common rule requirement for single IRB review, the NIH policy speaks to institutions conducting the same exact protocol or carrying out the same exact protocol at multiple sites. So if you think about your like typical maybe industry sponsored multi-site trial where you got a PI at every site and they're all implementing the same trial procedures at every site, not like, you know, I'm doing the data analysis here and we're going to collect data from students here and we're going to collect data from employees there. No, like that's not what fits this policy. That's going to fall under that other common rule requirement for single IRB review in 2020. What falls under this now is when our investigators are conducting the exact same protocol at multiple sites. It applies to domestic awardees and domestic sites only. So if they're working with an international partner or at an international site, they are not required to comply with this policy, or the international site, that is. And requires that the research, again, is reviewed by a single IRB with limited exceptions. The single IRB plan for review, and again, this is important in the proposal development stage, that plan for the review by a single IRB and the communication between IRBs and sites needs to be included in the application or proposal. And if it's accepted and the award is received, it'll become a term and condition of that award. So this doesn't mean that investigators, if we're not the reviewing site, that doesn't mean they're off the hook here at the ORP or at Penn State. They still have to do some things on our end. So generally speaking, they still have to contact our IRB as early as possible in the proposal development stage so that we can talk about whether we can serve as the IRB of record if necessary, or whether we can rely on another institution's IRB. We have standards or criteria around those things. And so it's just not like, hey, Ohio State wants to be the reviewing IRB. Okay, no, that's not how things work. And so we have to make that determination. And we're integral to that process. So investigators still have to submit an external IRB request in CATS IRB. So we're going to carry out some things that we do that may not directly be related to the IRB review. And those things are ancillary reviews like conflict of interest, biosafety review if the study requires that. So we're ensuring that those things are done. We're going to check training and qualifications of the study staff that are listed, and the study staff then have to be listed on that external IRB submission. We're going to communicate necessary information to the reviewing IRB, maybe information, again, that is specific to Penn State or specific to Pennsylvania if the reviewing IRB is somewhere else. And we're going to also execute and document that reliance arrangement. So no reliance arrangement can be made by an investigator on their own. They cannot come up with some other agreement. We must be involved in that process. We must execute that agreement, okay? And that agreement must be in place before the research begins. Follow our SOPs for reporting information to our office when necessary if we are not reviewing IRB. So there are certain things that we're going to want to know because stuff is happening here at Penn State. And they must be responsible for protecting human subjects, data, specimens of those subjects here at Penn State. So I've listed some available resources for you where you can find news on the updated Common Rule and more information if you want to learn about something more in depth. I'm happy to talk with you or to answer your questions as well. I've also listed some areas where you can find information on training, either via the ORP website in terms of events that are already scheduled, or through requesting a particular presentation for your class, for your department, for a particular group of individuals. We're happy to come out and talk to you about changes, how they'll affect you, your research, your faculty members' research, and do anything that we can to make this process a little bit easier. Here's our contact information, and that's it. And I am still happy. I'm fine on time, so if you have questions that you'd like to ask me before we leave, I am happy to stay for a couple minutes.
Thank you to Sarah for doing this presentation for us today. If you want to stay after and ask questions, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll see you next semester.